What's your name? What's your name? We're waiting on 2 people. We'll start as soon as they come, or we'll give them 2 minutes. Are you Ryan?
Yeah.
Yeah, Pacey, right? Okay, we're gonna start. So this lecture will cover general topics within international relations. Yeah, that must be her. Are you Belinda? Okay. Yeah, so this lecture will cover general topics in international relations. It will go over a couple of different theories within international relations. We'll talk about debate applications as we go through those theories. And we'll also discuss a lot of common terms within international relations. So to begin, can any of you answer what is international relations? What do you guys think it is? Yeah.
Just how countries interact with each other.
Yeah, so it basically provides an overview of, it's descriptive about the nature of the world, and they seek to understand, describe, and predict events and trends in international politics. In particular, the behavior of states by using past state trends, strategic tendencies, and state psychology. So the Treaty of Westphalia is the creation of the modern nation state. It was the beginning of IR theory. It established this notion of sovereignty, which created borders between states. That is when all types of state political philosophies began, and that is also when the IR theory started to make sense. So Westphalian sovereignty is the idea that the states have rights to whatever lies within their own borders. This incentivizes competition between states, as they're all independent actors in a much larger system. IR is the study of those relationships. So there are a couple of levels of IR theory. First is the individual level. This covers what politicians, bureaucrats, military officials, and basically how do an individual's political beliefs or interests affect international politics. The second level of IR theory is the state level. This discusses political processes within a state. For example, how democracies might behave differently than autocracies in the international arena, and how dictatorships might be effective. It discusses the benefits and disadvantages of different types of political processes. The macro level of IR theory is the international level. This covers states' interests, structures of power, major powers, lesser powers, and geographical proximity between greater powers. Each level of IR theory tries to explain how IR concerns itself when predicting the future. And each of those are all equally important in trying to determine state trends for the future. Any questions? Yeah. Yeah, so that's just a description of the international level of IR theory. It describes how states' interests work, structures of power work, what major power tendencies are, what minor power tendencies are, and the geographical proximity between powers. A lot of the literature, so the next kind of group of stuff that we'll talk about is collective action problems. A lot of the literature in IR theory focuses on the problem of organizing collective action on an international scale. So how do states cooperate and carry out a certain goal when they have a common interest? And how do they contribute to the production of these global goods that other states need? So the first issue is the tragedy of the commons. Does anyone know what the tragedy of commons is? Okay, so it's a theory by Garrett Hardin. It comes from the standpoint of each state, It is when each state is self-interested, and because they're self-interested, they all want to maximize their own access to a certain resource. The cost of each state acting in their own self-interest is externalized to the group as a whole. So a common example that is used currently is that's not relevant to really IR theory, but think about fuel companies when it comes to global warming. All fuel companies are self-interested, so they all take advantage of resources, and the overall cost and damage that is done is global warming. Now, this can also apply to an international level when states all have a common goal, or when the states are all self-interested in something, then that can hurt global access to that resource, which might be important in the future. Another thing is that these resources are usually finite, and they are known as non-excludable resources in economics. The next problem with collective action is the prisoner's dilemma. Does anyone know what this is? Yeah. Oh, okay. Okay. So it's when acting in one's self-interest worsens our own state, because every person acts in self-interest. That means that we are in more risk to hurt ourselves as a result of someone else's decision. A common example of this would be nuclear proliferation. We're all probably better off in a world without nuclear weapons, but because everyone has a security dilemma, which we'll talk about later, they all attempt to maximize their own resources or maximize their own nuclear weapons, which puts other people in threats. A few other common terms that are used in collective action problems are positive sum, when the collective actions of states lead to a better off consequence. And then there's a negative sum, when the sum total of actions is negative. Another common part of IR theory is the issue of free riding. Does anyone know what this is? So a free rider is basically someone who benefits off the production of some collective good without contributing to it. So a current example would be Trump's complaints about how the U.S. provides way too much of the defense budget and how they provide way too much of defense for their cooperation with the EU. So his claim would be that the EU is free riding. Whether they actually are not, that's debatable, but that is an example of free riding. The reason that free riding is hard to deal with in the global frame is that it is a global good. So like things like security are all a global good. So if one state wants to maximize their own security, in order to maximize their own security, they would have to provide security, and they would have to cooperate with other states. They would have to provide security globally, which is probably the reason that the U.S. spends more than any other country on military spending. After the Cold War, the U.S. took the role of guaranteeing world security, and they started to attempt to act like the world policeman. And other actors have taken advantage of that. So this would be in contrast to a private good, but rather it is a public good, because it is a good that is accessible to everyone. Security is not a private good. In order to guarantee world security and security for oneself, you cannot just do it for yourself. You would have to provide security everywhere. Another common part about about IR theory is the public choice theory and rationality of state actors. So can someone answer the question, do states always act in self-interest?
Yeah.
So think about examples in which they don't act in self-interest.
I think it would probably be actor-specific, like one person has a different philosophy from the rest of the country who is in power.
So like from a security standpoint, why would a state not act in self-interest? Yeah.
I would actually argue the opposite, that like almost every international policy system can be traced back to self-interest. Like all of our allyships with other countries have to do with self-interest in some way, like economic security for us, or like securing partnerships.
Yeah, so what I'm trying to get at is that, yes, the terminal goal might be self-interest, but that requires a lot of times to act not in the self-interest of one. So you talked about like allyship building and relationship building. That opens up possible risks that you would not want to take in normal like alliances, or that is a risk that you would probably not take if you were completely self-interested. So a couple of examples in which states do not act according to their self-interest is when they commit calculation errors, or when they have common goals or future goals that align with that of other states. So a common one would be linking up with other states to solve a common goal of like global warming. Public choice theorists believe that states only act in their short-term interests, and they do not care about their future interests. And dealing with structural irrationalities that exist within states is a key component of how states take actions. So now we'll talk about the security dilemma. This argues that states can only improve their own security by worsening the security of other states. So it treats security as a zero-sum game, which means that every single action that you have trades off with the disadvantage of another state. So there are two types of states that are framed within the security dilemma. There are status quo states and there are revisionist states. By the nature of their terms, or by the nature of their definitions, can anyone guess what is the function of a status quo state and what is the function of a revisionist state? Okay, so a status quo state is simply a state that would want to maintain the status quo. And a revisionist state is a state that would like to revise the status quo. So a common theme is that status quo states would obviously seem to fear revisionist states, and that is where tension and conflict starts to build up. So revisionist states are consistently building up their militaries, preparing for battle and conflict. But if status quo states were to fear against that, they also begin to build their own military to defend themselves. However, because one state cannot necessarily predict the goals of another state, if a status quo state starts to build up their own military systems, then there are other states that could fear them as revisionist states. Does that make sense? So this leads to the problem of escalation. As more states start to build up their own militaries, because it's very hard to predict the terminal goals of another state, all states act in their own self-interest and try to guarantee their own security. Yeah.
What was that one called again?
So this is I was just describing the conflict between status quo states and revisionist states.
Or what is that conflict called then?
It was escalation. Or it describes the beginning of escalation, at least. So can someone think of a warrant for why states would rather err on the side of self-security rather than also build up and risk escalation?
Because escalation primarily is going to harm like the global political scene as opposed to like the internal workings of the country.
Yeah. So this comes back to the theory that states are still self-interested, and they attempt to guarantee their own security first before global security. However, this does assume that offense and defense in the security realm is indistinguishable. So can someone tell me the difference between offense and defense in security politics? So think about offense and defense in debate, and then apply that to how states might act. What is an offensive capability and what is a defensive capability? Yeah.
And I think just a face value of offensive capability would be the ability to mobilize and attack another nation, whereas defensive would be to protect yourself.
Yeah, that's all it is. So the reason that this theory assumes that offense and defense is indistinguishable is because otherwise it seems like states could just increase their own defense systems, but not threaten opponents with offense, if it was distinguishable, which would seem to stop this entire escalation conflict. States also attempt to give advanced warning of aggressions, since they attempt to build offensive weapons, and that gives them time to defend themselves. So states will usually have a certain type of defense system that can alert them of any other states attempting to have common offensive capabilities. So these systems are usually called early warning systems. They allow states to stay at a low level of defense and rapidly increase their arms production if another states also build up arms. This also means that a low level of arms is more stable, since you can deter a threat after it develops, but avoids the need to deter a surprise attack by having lots of arms, even when you don't have a reason to fear any imminent attack. Can anyone think of a benefit of early warning systems? Yeah.
When you can prepare for an attack from another nation.
Yes, but why is it necessary to do it at a faster rate? What if you have miscalculated and maybe that state is not building up? Why is an early warning system still good?
And you're just working with more information than you would have been.
Yeah, what's your answer?
If there is a security threat, you can act much more quickly once it arises.
Yeah, you can't wait for your enemy to mobilize. You need to make alliances quickly, and you need to develop your arms capability quickly. There's also the theory of the Pareto efficiency problem. This is when, yeah, what's up?
I had a question with the early warning system. How is that any different than having like arms already set aside?
So early warning. So the difference is that early warning systems is not. So when you already have arms set aside, that means that you have already produced them, which means that you have already spent resources on them, and other states have already are starting to build up their own arms as a result of what you have done. An early warning system only tells you, or you used certain scoping capabilities of your own nation to analyze other states' arms production levels. If they're producing a lot of arms, then an early warning system allows you to rapidly develop your own arms. So you are not building arms immediately, or you're not building them preemptively. Rather, based on very good knowledge of what another state is doing, that is the only instance in which you would build arms. Any other questions regarding early warning systems? So back to the Pareto efficiency problem. This is when a state where it is not possible to make some or all of states better off without making some states worse off. An inefficient situation could be made more Pareto efficient by benefiting some parties without harming other parties. It does not concern itself with the question of how goods should be distributed, since redistribution sometimes harms some and still makes others better off. So now we'll go into more specific theories in IR politics. So the first is realism. Has anyone heard of realism? Yeah.
Like, isn't that like Machiavelli?
Somewhat. He clarified basically parts of it, but it claims that states are driven by zero-sum competition to maximize their relative power or security. That is like the fundamental idea behind realism. They assume that the international arena is fundamentally unstable and dangerous. It also assumes that states need to ensure their own continued existence to survive, which is why all states are not wrong in being self-interested. So classical realism was defined by Morgenthau. It is a theory on individual level that human nature is always power-hungry and concerned with our self-interests. If this is how human nature operates, then how can it explain realism on a state basis? Can anyone answer that? If all individuals seem self-interested or power-hungry, then why might states be more realist?
Because they're run by the people.
Yeah. Another part within realism is neorealism and structural realism. Mearsheimer talks about this. He says that the structure of the international arena dictates that states have to pursue relative power, regardless of the preferences of any individual leaders. So what is relative power? Relative power is simply when one state attempts to maximize its own power comparatively to another state. He also says that states are the primary actors in international arena, and their primary concern is their own survival. There's no international police for them to call on at certain times, so they must always have offensive military capability. And the reason that alliances can never be fully trusted is because intentions are never fully transparent between states, because it's hard to know what other possible states are thinking. For example, you could, on the surface level, have an interaction with another state and think that they're an ally, but in reality, they may have other common goals other than just treating you as an ally. For example, they may want to use your allyship as a reason to exploit some of your resources or something like that. This also starts to develop the primacy of hard power. Does anyone know what hard power is? Or the distinction between hard power and soft power? Yeah.
Is hard power military stuff and then soft power kind of I think.
Yeah, we'll talk more about soft power, but hard power is primarily military primacy and military capability. It is a use of force by various military means to control another country or subject it to one country's influence. Now, can someone think of what soft power means? Yeah.
Isn't soft power a diplomatic power to influence other countries without force?
Yeah, it's basically any type of persuasion, diplomatic means, trade, and other linkages that attempt to control another state. So, how can trade be used, or how can linkages be used to attempt to keep another state down? For example, if one country is very dependent on another country for trade goods, yeah.
You can still economic sanctions.
Yeah, so if one country is very dependent on another country for a very vital good, then that country that provides the good seems to have some kind of relative power over them. Linkages are important because when two countries link up to attempt to solve a common problem, and if one country has the resources to better solve that problem, then they would also seem to have relative power over the other state. So now back to kind of the entire theory of the security dilemma. It's basically the entire description of arms races and uncertainty over other states. So can someone think of an empirical example of the security dilemma? What was the most common one, but it never resulted in actual conflict?
The Cold War.
Yeah, what was the Cold War?
That was the arms race between the United States and Russia after they achieved nuclear power.
Yeah, so they were never actually planning to strike each other, but they did develop weapons consistently out of pure uncertainty. And they've developed a ton of nuclear weapons as a result of that. So that is a real-life instance of the security dilemma. There's also an important difference between balancing and bandwagoning. Can someone think of what balancing is? So say you have two states, or say you have one major power, and then you have a couple of smaller powers. Why might the smaller powers have a reason to be afraid? Yeah.
Because the one major power at any time can do whatever they want.
Yeah, and according to a realist theory, all states are self-interested. So what is the likely response of the smaller states to that major power? They would form an alliance and attempt to balance against a larger state. That is what balancing is. It's when a certain group of states or a singular state identifies that there is a larger threat present, and they attempt to balance against that threat so that the threat cannot take any actions. Now, what is another option that smaller states could also do in that instance? For example, balancing against a major power might make a smaller state think that there is a very large risk towards them, because what if the major power was to strike them? So what is the other option for smaller powers? Yeah.
The bandwagon, which is to basically join up with another large country.
Yeah, so they would bandwagon with the larger state and allow the larger state to continue doing whatever they do, and they would just operate under that state. In which case, they've somewhat failed their more structural goal because they are being dominated by another state. You can also apply parts of social contract theory and how that operates within how people function within a government to bandwagoning and balancing. For example, would smaller states give up some of their rights to make sure that they can guard against a large-scale intervention? The next major theory in IR is liberalism. This is distinct from realism. This theory says that state preferences, rather than state capabilities, are the primary determinant of state behavior. Unlike realism, where the state is seen as a unitary actor, liberalism allows more flexibility with state actions. So soft power has a lot of more credibility in liberalism because states can commonly use diplomatic engagement, trade uses, and other persuasive appeals to strike deals based on their preferences. Because what a state can do is not just based on what they're capable of doing, but also based on how they organize their preferences, according to a liberalist standpoint. This can also be applied to theories like the democratic peace theory, because political organizations that are like democracies are more likely to be safe and smarter, as their preferences align. So instances of this would be like the Larry Diamond 95 card, which talks a lot about how, because states all have a very similar preference, they all attempt to, or especially when they are democracies, and they want to spread that more across the international landscape, then they're more likely to be with that peace with each other. Liberalism is probably also provides more relationships between countries, because if it's not solely based on hard power, but rather is more inclusive of soft power, there are more ideas and goods that can cross borders. As if everything is based within state preferences, states are more likely to be open to others as they attempt to achieve those preferences. So this leads to also the concept of neoliberalism, as goods and ideas flow very freely across borders, and there is a lack of state control over what can happen. The more economic terms behind neoliberalism I won't talk about, because we'll keep this to a security discussion. The next major theory is mercantilism. This is ideologically opposed to the concept of free trade. So when it comes to economic liberalism, mercantilists share the belief of realists that each individual state must protect its own interests without seeking mutual gains through other international organizations. They focus on relative gains, which means that they attempt to consistently strengthen their economy, but make sure that other people's economies are also not strengthened. So this makes for policies like protectionism and economic nationalism, which is definitely worse for security because it ruins relations with other countries, and it pits states against each other. So now we'll talk a little bit more about polarity. So there are three major parts of polarity. There is unipolarity, bipolarity, and multipolarity. We'll be talking about the benefits and disadvantages to each. And there are a lot of studies that can disagree with our arguments, obviously, and they conduct different reviews on the international stability of each of these systems. So does anyone know what unipolarity is? So think of the prefix, and then think of how this might apply in the international landscape. Yeah.
Does it emphasize like international policy that relates to like creating unity between countries?
Unipolarity is more based on one country having complete dominance over other countries. That is why the prefix is uni. So they are the unipole. So this was very descriptive of the USA's hard power capability after the Cold War, or like for a couple of years after the Cold War. So it's when no other smaller states even have a chance of contesting them, at least in the security realm. So can someone think about a benefit to unipolarity? This is also otherwise known as hegemony. Yeah.
Being able to control most of the world or being entirely safe?
Yeah, so it guarantees absolute security to whichever state becomes the unipole. But on a more larger frame, why might it still be good? So think about how we talked about bandwagoning balancing, and think about how smaller powers might act. Yeah.
It gives the smaller powers like a large amount of security, whereas if they have to defend themselves, they might be at more security risks.
Yeah, so so the first thing is that no single power or no smaller power is likely to be vicious against another smaller power, because they're afraid of retaliations from the large power, which would be much worse than retaliations from another smaller power. Now, are countries like to balance or bandwagon against a unipole? Both have happened, but which one could be beneficial to world security? Why would that be more beneficial?
Because
Or why is that beneficial under unipolarity?
I think because it evens out the global scale, because the large power doesn't want to attack the small powers don't want to attack each other, the small powers don't want to attack the large power.
So that kind of crosses into deterrence theory. If deterrence is successful, then your argument might be true. But the reason that that is worse than a world where smaller countries simply bandwagon with the larger power is because there's still a conflict that is present. And deterrence can always risk breakdown, which can lead to escalation. So, in simpler terms, the reason that unipolarity could be good is because smaller countries might want to bandwagon with a larger country, in which case they wouldn't trigger a conflict. Now, what are possible reasons that unipolarity might be bad? Yeah.
Oh, it leads to things like imperialism.
Yeah, so it leads to major powers leading, like, they can, because they have complete control, there's nothing that can retaliate against them, which can lead to intervention in any country, and the major power can justify that. So what would be an example of an intervention, at least in the last 3 decades, that was probably a result, or the reason that a unipole may have intervened within another country?
There's a Syrian conflict.
Why would that be an example?
I think it's more bipolarity.
So, like, think about Bush's regime.
The Gulf War, probably.
Yeah. So they intervened in Iraq, they intervened in Iran. That was all because they knew that their own security was completely justified. And they knew that they were the clear unipole at that time, at least. That's one of the reasons that they, from a security standpoint, they may have felt more comfortable with intervention. The second problem is that if we come back to this balancing argument, countries are more likely to counterbalance against them, which increases the risk of an attack. There's an author called Monteiro, which provides a lot of statistical analysis behind this theory. Now, the next type of polarity is bipolarity. Can anyone think of what bipolarity could mean? So think about unipolarity, and then think about the prefix for bipolarity. Yeah.
Having 2 major powers like America and Russia.
Yeah, that's the common one. Why might bipolarity be beneficial? Yeah.
Like, in the case of like intervention or something, there could be like another power that could like check back.
Yeah, so that's a more smaller one, but that is definitely still a benefit because the 2 powers can check back against any revisionist state because they also see those revisionist states as threats to themselves. What's the second benefit? If you have 2 very powerful states, then what is the likelihood of one of those powerful states doing something bad? What is it?
Very low.
Why?
Because then the other power.
Yeah, they deter against each other. So this was common in the US and USSR example. Yes, they may have built up a ton of different weapons, but they never attacked each other. There are also possible disadvantages to this. So what is one reason that bipolarity might be bad? So if 2 countries are attempting to balance against each other, why could that go wrong? Yeah.
It'll cause escalation.
Yeah, there could be miscalculation, which could result in a huge conflict. And they both would want to race to the top with building up arms, and that could have bad side effects as well. The final kind of theory behind polarity is multipolarity. Can someone think of what this might mean? Yeah.
There's multiple large powers.
Yeah, there are multiple powers of equal capability. Why might this be good? What is the likelihood of one state being very threatening or attempting to intervene somewhere.
Very low.
Yeah, because they will be checked back by other states. What is the reason that multipolarity might be bad? So what happens if one state gets aggressive and another state attempts to check back against it? Then what happens? Yeah.
Okay, conflict.
Yeah, conflict. And then that can escalate, that can bring in more allies, and that could lead to a larger conflict. So now we'll talk more about specifically geographic balancing. Geography has a very clear, large impact on the functions of world politics. Land power usually matters the most because it's about what it allows what a country to control territory, get access to different resources, and land is simply easier to navigate and manipulate and build upon. There's also water power, navy power, and this is commonly known as offshore balancing, as it's done by one who is surrounded by water and balances from another coast. Yeah.
What do you mean by balancing?
So like balancing is simply attempting to check another power. So they would be not intervening to check against them, but rather they would use they would simply attempt to use say soft power to check against them from their own coast, or attempt to use navy power to make sure that they're not crossing any borders. So if one state becomes a hegemon in their continent, then offshore balancers are in trouble because they're constantly in a defensive posture. And they're fighting from home, which means that they risk intervention from whoever the actor is or whoever the threat is. The US right now is an example of an attempted transition into offshore balancing, as we're bringing a lot of forces back, and we're also changing Obama's Asia pivot. Trump wants to reduce its hard reach into Asia, and we're transitioning into a very defensive posture. And the UK is probably the best example of offshore balancing in history. The next major theory in IR is Constructivism. So this talks about what anarchy is, what states make of it, and that state behavior is still governed by norms, even if it is not governed by law in the state itself. If states are cooperative, they will establish norms that other states will follow. And this causes states to behave differently than they did back then. Now we can talk more about how international institutions foster cooperation, which is a vital part in attempting to balance against a larger power. So, how do you guys think one state can make sure that another state will cooperate with them? What is the problem with cooperation? Why might it be hard? Yeah.
If states have different interests, it's really hard for them to cooperate at all.
So let's say even if they had similar interests.
I mean, oftentimes you have to use force to get states to cooperate, whether it's like economic sanctions or power.
So I guess what I'm trying to get at more is the commitment problem. This is when every state could probably be better off if everyone committed to cooperate. But if one state sees that it would be individually beneficial to them if they defected, then they might defect from that cooperation, and they might no longer want to participate in that cooperation. The reason that this might be bad is because each single state faces this incentive structure. And if each state ends up defecting, then even though it is better for everyone to cooperate, because each state might think that if I defect individually and no one else does, then I will get a benefit for myself. Yeah.
So like OPEC, if
Yeah, that's one example. Another example is like a recent one. Trump decided to defect from the Paris climate deal. Now, that means that other states might want to also defect from it, and that could lead to a very bad global repercussion regarding warming. Obviously, there are a ton of other arguments in that, but that's just a common example that's used. So how might international institutions attempt to solve this cooperation issue? So the first thing is that they could set standards of cooperation. Both sides know what defection is, and they might want to figure out what they can expect if the other side was to defect. This could be done in some kind of treaty. This codifies conditional cooperation so that states can expect retaliation if they do defect, or some type of punishment if they do defect. The second thing that international institutions can do is use verification regimes. This can be used to detect defection and allow other states to punish it. So if we exist in, say, a multipolar world, and all states agree to link up on one issue and have a treaty regarding one issue, if one state defects, then there are multiple other states that are still able to check against that. Another thing that states can do is that sometimes the reason that commitment or alliance or like cooperation is hard is because there's a lack of communication and lack of transparency regarding interests. So states can be more transparent and they can make it easier to get together and find an agreement. And the final thing that states can do is attempt to resolve disputes. They could attempt to resolve ambiguities in agreement and miscommunication that cause cooperation to break down, even when both sides want to cooperate. So when they believe the other side has defected, they can attempt to resolve that dispute by coming together to an agreement. This also is better than retaliation because retaliation always risks going out of control and triggering a conflict. For example, trade wars. The final part of this lecture will cover an analysis of nuclear weapons and how that has changed IR. This will also be super helpful for all of you whenever you have to face a util scenario that includes some kind of nuclear war. So the first thing is that nuclear weapons have totally changed international relations because you no longer need allies for self-defense. It's about getting under the nuclear umbrella, not maximizing your own relative military strength. You don't need to win a war to impose massive costs upon another state. You can do it immediately. So the difference between nuclear weapons and other weapons is that nuclear weapons are absolute, whereas other weapons are relative. Since you can destroy an opponent regardless of your relative numbers of like arms or other types of weapons. This also makes arms races irrelevant in the current age. An important part for every country is to make sure that they have second strike capability. What this means is that they need to have an arsenal that can impose significant costs on an adversary, even if their first strike or even if their initial types of weapons have been downed by an opponent. Any action attacking the state can escalate into a conflict, which can lead to nuclear war. So there are only a handful of states that have second strike capability. The reason that it is super important is because it also functions as an additional deterrent against states that might want to initially trigger some kind of conflict. So you might think, why, if all states have nuclear weapons, then why don't they just deter against each other? And why doesn't it just cancel out? The reason that it does not, there are a couple of reasons why it does not cancel out. The first reason is that certain states can use a limited nuclear strike, not expecting a complete attack or a complete retaliation. So they might zone in on a smaller attack or they might attempt to take out their opponent's nuclear weapons first, or down some important part of their defense systems. The second reason that it doesn't cancel out is that they can put nukes on progressively higher alert to increase the risk of a nuclear strike on an adversary without inviting a response. This is also known as like tight coupling and delegation of authority. The reason that it's beneficial is that when you put your weapons on higher alert, they're likely to sense certain, sense whenever they're being scoped out by an opponent, or whenever opponents' systems are very high in terms of their defense capability. Another reason that deterrence does not completely work is because some states or some revisionist states are already unhappy with the status quo. So when their survival is already threatened by other states, or if they sense that they're going to experience a losing war anyways, they're likely to be indifferent to suicide and attempt to impose as much damage possible on another state. The final reason that deterrence does not work 100% of the time is that everything that we are discussing is all based on what could probably happen, which means that there's always room for miscalculation, because we come back to how the realist views IR. The realist does not contain a transparent view of what other states will necessarily do, which means that it's very hard to sense what other states can do, which means that it's always possible to miscalculate their interests. This also explains why a defensive posture versus nuclear weapons is bad, because it hurts your own second strike capability, which is what states are usually scared of. If you don't prove that you have sufficient offensive capability to impede enough damage on another state, then other states will feel comfortable with attacking you. And that eliminates any possibility of a deterrent. So obviously a lot of the material that was covered in this lecture was a very quick description of very nuanced theories. So I'll finish up the lecture by providing a couple of additional reads for you guys that you can search up and read more about. So you should probably take notes on these. So the first one is by Kenneth Waltz. It's called The Man, the State, and War. The second one is by Jerry Diamond. It's called Guns, Germs, and Steel. Another one is by Thomas Schelling. It's called Arms and Influence. There's also one by James Scott. It's called Seeing Like a State: How Certain Schemes to Improve the Human Condition Have Failed. There's an article by David Halberstam, The Best and the Brightest. Sorry, I think that's a book. And then regarding polarity, here are a couple of articles that can also answer those questions. There's one by Robert Jervis, Perceptions and Misperception in International Politics. This dives deeply into the more psychological component of how states act. There's one by John Mearsheimer, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. Yeah.
Can you repeat the first one?
Robert Jervis, Perceptions and Misperception in International Politics. Yeah.
Sorry, can you repeat the last one, the tragedy?
Yeah, the second one is by John Mearsheimer, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And then there's one by Henry A. Kissinger, White House Years and Years of Upheaval. This is more specific to U.S. foreign policy. I think that having this kind of background knowledge of IR and security will help you a lot, not just if you are a util debater, but it will help you even if you're a K debater and you're attempting to, and you commonly face these type of positions. Because knowing a lot about your opponent's scenario not only makes you sound more credible, but you're also able to tie it into whatever critique you end up reading against their position. For example, there are a lot of criticisms of, we talked a lot about unipolarity, reasons that that might fail. You can have a lot of different interactions between critical theories and unipolarity per se, or any criticism of the US at large. But yeah, that's it. Any other questions? No questions? Cool.